In this lecture, we will be taking a look at world systems theory and its role in understanding the history of colonialism. Your author describes colonialism as being the political, social, economic, and cultural domination of a physical space or territory and its people by a foreign power for an extended period of time. Once again, the political, social, economic, and cultural domination of a territory or geographic region and its people by a foreign power for an extended period of time. As you can imagine, anthropologists studying the outcomes of this process have not only applied their anthropological concerns to the matter, but have really been forced to become historians of sort. So to anthropologists studying colonialism and what came after, in this case globalization, have had to become activists, working in this case to promote cultural survival, a growing concern by not only people in the field, in this case anthropologists, but also indigenous peoples and local governments. You will find posted in relation to this lecture a recent article by Amber O'Connor, anthropologist working out of the University of Texas in Austin, taking a look at traditional foodways or traditional food practices and the idea of identity in this post-colonial world. To better understand the social, cultural, and historical mechanisms of the process of colonialism, we have to take a look at a very important example. In this case, the 16th and 17th century colonialism that typified the discoveries and exploration of the Spanish in the Americas and the centuries which followed. We will be highlighting the practices, the concepts associated with Spanish colonialism in the 18th century in order to understand the 5-century-long practice of contact, exploration, and colonialism in this region. Spanish colonialism in this case can be described as a process of building dynastic unions. You had the development of kingdoms and principalities all interwoven and bound together within a symbolic figurehead, in this case the figurehead of the Spanish king. In the case of American Spanish holdings, we see several patterns, both within the colonial age and in the centuries to follow, centuries that really were typified by a movement toward independence, as being unique. So we'll take a closer look at some of these patterns. The first concept, this idea of the development of reinos or vice-royalties, is important for understanding how that dynastic union was woven together or how it was bound together within an imperial system. So a reinos or a vice-royalty was important for territorial reason, but also governance. We see reinos such as New Spain, Peru, New Granada, Buenos Aires, all of these as being important building blocks for Spanish imperialism in the Americas. Viceroyalities, in a sense, had their own local system of governance that incorporated local indigenous political practices. But all of these reinos ultimately were subjugated under a much larger system that encompassed the globe. And this system, in a sense, was typified by the presence of Castilians or colonial administrators who were literally rooted in Spain but oversaw all of the different colonial provinces throughout the Spanish Empire. The Castilians would meet periodically in Madrid to control the activities of their American and Pacific colonial holdings through a system of trade restriction and taxation. And this was very similar to what we saw with British colonial rule. Nationalism and citizenship kept the colonial administrative authority together. It bound indigenous peoples to this larger global system of leadership. In the Americas, specifically in Mesoamerica and northern and western portions of what is today South America, Indigenous populations would pay their own tax. They considered it to be a kind of tribute to vice royalties and ultimately to the Castilian leadership in Spain. This became a way of establishing a secondary sense of citizenship within this colonial system. Ultimately, however, resistance crept into the system, and we see this as we look into the future from this 18th century starting point. When we take a look at the colonial resistance of the 19th and early 20th century throughout regions that were controlled by the Spanish, we start to see the foundations of not only the post-colonial age, but really many of the countries that have grown out of this process in our global age. Your author identifies the process of globalization, again, coming on the heels of the colonial and ultimately the post-colonial age, as being the accelerating interdependence or interdependency of nations in a world system, linked economically and through things like mass media. I would add to this that globalization is actually a process of popular sovereignty, not only at the ground level, where we see a wide variety of language communities struggling for their own cultural heritage, but also at the national level. You think about the interests of countries such as Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, all of their contributions to what is today governing powers such as the United Nations are really occurring through a lens. It's a lens of reaction to the problems, the mistrust that occurred during the Spanish colonialism in these regions. You also see this in World Conference gatherings. Your author will highlight a very important gathering, a pan-tribal, transnational gathering of indigenous and nationalized people that occurred in the summer of 1992, the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, which met in Rio de Janeiro. We saw in this case the combination of interests, those of diplomats, journalists, environmentalists, anthropologists, and over 300 representatives of tribal nations that were caught up in this period of colonialism. These are examples of the resistance that is very common and something that we've all been exposed to as we pick up a newspaper or we watch the evening news. However, there are other forces and processes of subsequent resistance that I would like to highlight for you before we move on. The first is creolization. Traditionally a linguistic concept, creolization in this case is a concept of blending. So blending both local traditions and those of that power structure that oversees local environments during colonial periods. So creolization, considered to be a process of blending in order to survive. I preserve my cultural heritage by blending it with that of the dominant power group. Decolonialism is a process, and I think the best byproduct of this process is what we have with the United Nations today. It's a process that's not solely economic in nature, it's not solely political in nature. It really cuts across a variety of social, cultural, political, and economic spheres. But really it is a process of establishing popular sovereignty on a global stage. So this would be movements of resistance, of education, of awareness that have a final product, which is to have representation among the developed global nations today. Both creolization and decolonialism are nonviolent processes of trying to reestablish sovereignty after the colonial age. Now let's take a look at what has changed through the eyes of cultural anthropologists. How has culture changed? How do we better understand this idea of global social space? And what is anti-imperialism? What are two of its primary characteristics? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that our understanding of culture has changed as we shift from a historic point of view to a modern or even a postmodern or futuristic point of view. So culture, in a sense, has been deterritorialized. It no longer has boundaries. It is something that is truly a product of the mind. Some anthropologists believe today that in our global age, we have really lost culture in its traditional sense. We have readily lost a sense of nationality, of cultural objects and traditions, and the people that transport them. I think this is going a little bit far, but I do think that there is relevancy to this idea. For anthropologists looking at globalization and the history which led up to it, this idea of a global social space or global social spaces seems to be synonymous with or can even take the place of our traditional understanding of what culture is. Global social spaces would represent the geographic areas or territories or landscapes where cultural heritage is expressed through different kinds of foods, through different kinds of song, through traditional practices, through traditional expressions of what family is or what marriage is. For politicians and activists working in these once colonial contexts, there has been the rise of a philosophy understood today as anti-imperialism. So let me just break down for you real quickly what this philosophy is. The first characteristic is that we should ignore colonial powers or imperial powers and really understand that there are traditional cultural or traditional global social expressions of life on the planet. And as we begin to understand them and preserve them, or even awaken them in a sense, we reject the idea of a colonial affectedness or the remnants of a colonial power that maybe for a short period of time attempted to do away with them or cover them up. The second characteristic in this philosophy is the idea of the West, or of Western capitalism, as being kind of a source for much of the cultural heritage that has been lost over the last 500 to 600 years. The remnants of the West then becomes the nations, in a sense, such as the United States and European nations, that have a connection to the colonial past. Whether they were initially the colonized and later the colonizers really doesn't matter. It's that they at one time partook in this political, economic, and social practice. Many anti-imperialists believe that even if you remove the countries of the colonial past, their philosophy of dominance and of control associated with the idea of the West will remain. However, it will be an abstraction. It will be non-territorial, yet unifying. It will be represented in symbolic systems and remain present even when that system of control is gone. I think the best example of this is speaking a colonial tongue even after a colonial power has left. So English in India or French in the Caribbean Sea region. So as social scientists, social theorists, and researchers, we have to ask ourselves what philosophy or what conceptual tool can we have or utilize to best understand all of the actions that transpire in this one-time colonial landscape? Well, there are some building blocks for this. First, we'll introduce two terms, the idea of core and the idea of periphery. So as your author points out, the idea of core is something that we would want to associate with the dominant structural position in a world system. This would be the actor who is kind of controlling the game. Core would represent an area from which new traditions are being established in a colonial territory, or if it is associated with resistance, it could be an area where traditions are housed and preserved. In contrast to this, periphery represents the weakest structural position within a world systems. This is, in a sense, the recipient, the actor who, in a sense, supports the process, but really, in the end, is losing out, losing language, losing tradition, losing even an understanding of who they are and what community is, losing their identity. So the world systems approach has historically helped anthropologists to understand this idea of cultural transmission and how it occurs. And it has resulted in our attempt to redefine what culture is. Because as you can imagine, the more contact, the more struggle between core and periphery that occurs, whatever the historical circumstance is, the more change will be imposed on the idea of culture. So when you see a Mexican culture, what is that? What are the building blocks of a Mexican culture? Or if we look at the culture of modern Fiji, what are we actually seeing? What are the core values that are traditionally Fijian? And what core values may be imported from places like Southern Asia or from Great Britain? In order to make sense of culture in this post-colonial and global age, working again in the early 1970s, anthropologist Fred Gearing gives us the notion of global transaction. Gearing defined culture as being built up out of the transactions between members of communities and their environments over a wide variety of historical circumstances. He continued recognizing transactions to comprise interactions between peoples of very different positions within this colonial structure, and ultimately their environment. Gearing's transaction concepts really implies the idea of exchange in this case of information, and the behaviors that act to maintain the structures of a society, whether it's at the core or whether it is being changed at the periphery. So the successes of what we see of major global political structures such as the United Nations really are a byproduct of Gearing's perspective on how global transaction occurs in light of a colonial and a post-colonial age. The idea that, okay, we'll work within the framework that has been forcibly given to us, but we will make sure that our local voice is heard, and there will be exchange. If you are a student of business or economics, this concept, this idea, is very relevant to you because it's really been something that we've seen in these environment management strategies that have been imposed by the United Nations on their own members. In this case, blending together the perspective of natural resources from that of people on the ground, language communities that have lived in these regions for literally thousands of years, and then those perspectives of kind of the wider global society and what it's trying to accomplish as it combats things or topics or concepts such as global climate change. So environmental management strategies, as they have been implemented by these transnational global organizations such as the United Nations, have really been integral in bringing together global concerns and those of local regions and local language communities. Examples of this can be traditional subsistence strategies or traditional crops. We see this with modern Mayan coffee production and the involvement of not only the United Nations Population Fund, but also UNICEF. UNICEF members, for example, have focused their attention on not only the movement of donated funds to regions where it's needed, but also they've attempted to establish, in this case, fair trade relationships on a global scale. These partnerships have been very systematic in nature. They seem to, in a sense, reject the colonial past, but yet reflect elements of its, in this case, political, social, and economic structure. So the idea of a world systems approach toward understanding it is still very applicable. Another example would be from Northern Africa, which has been confronting high expressions of AIDS, or the AIDS virus in a sense, among local populations. Many of the international groups working in North African countries attempting to push back the tide of AIDS, they've really focused in a sense on restructuring the intentions and the perspectives of potential donors, so really promoting awareness. There has been an attempt to change the perspectives of donors, focusing on issues of local lifeways, of local suffering beyond, in this case, the suffering associated with the disease and the conduct, the activities which led up to an individual acquiring that disease. So they really have been bringing the international public into communities and demonstrating to them that not only do we have to focus on the epidemic and the educational programs in curbing that epidemic, but also really promoting a wide variety of health and educational programs outside of the primary initiative. We have even seen members of these transnational organizations which are bringing donor funds into places like North Africa, actually holding their conferences close to those areas where AIDS and other kinds of tragedies are being experienced on the ground. So bringing that awareness to the local environment and blending together not only the ideas and concerns of the global public and their whole reason for giving their money and their time, but also really promoting a stronger understanding of the interests, the lifeways, the traditions of people on the ground. Taking out of this blending process the whole tragedy that brought everybody to the table in the first place. It's a very healthy process. Before I complete this lecture with one additional ethnographic example, let me share with you really two important or key concepts that you want to retain when you think about systems theory and how it's being applied by anthropologists today. Anthropologists not only as ethnographers, archaeologists, but also activists attempting to preserve, in a sense, cultural heritage for future generations. The first concept relates to the notion of the system itself. What I would like you to remember is that having a systematic perspective means that when you look at a topic, when you study a topic, when you collect data, you really realize that there are many interrelated parts, and there's not one single source for information or one single source for a problem or an epidemic. And the second concept I'd like you to keep in mind is that social systems, or any sort of systematically behaving concept, they're not isolated. They actively import or incorporate information or tradition or power or concepts from outside of their structure and then maintain their structure by bringing those new ideas and concepts into it and blending it in. So the idea that there is a closed system is something we have to do away with. We have to realize that there are no boundaries to any concept such as culture, but these areas where we would anticipate a boundary as existing are actually areas where active transaction and blending occurs, and that it's healthy, and that it's healthy not only to the systems interacting with one another, but those being affected by that interactive process. The last ethnographic example that I would like to share with you in relation to this notion of world systems theory and the colonial age relates to a very recent process, one that dates to the first decade of the 20th century. In this case, the immigration of a really significant number of Japanese nationals to what is today the country of Brazil. This movement, which has resulted in quite a bit of culture change, really has at its center the idea of people migrating across national borders, in this case, borders associated with the sovereign nation of Japan and that of Brazil. And what's interesting about this is the motivation for this immigration. In this case, it was solely economic. People were looking to expand the job market or the labor market. They were looking for jobs outside of traditional national areas. So the initial waves of Japanese migrant laborers, workers and farmers in this case, so they were agriculturalists, with that we saw the development of a Japanese ethnic identity that also flowed along with them and brought a kind of cultural information or cultural traditions from Japan to Brazil. So as a result of this transnational global process, we see the development of a Japanese-Brazilian ethnic identity, initially in Brazil and then later imported back to Japan. The reason for this import then back to Japan is actually something that's very, very common to the study of migrant populations, and specifically populations that are moving from one location, a homeland, to a hostland environment for economic reasons, or reasons in this case having to do with helping their individual households. What we find is generally people recognize this as a temporary situation, and that the intent of many of these transnational populations that are, again, moving across borders for economic reasons is to bring the money and bring the resources and the prosperity back to their homeland, back to the starting point of their journey. And that's what we see with this Brazilian and Japanese exchange that occurs in the early 20th century. Many Japanese families moving to Brazil, one or two generations later, returned to Japan. These returning emigres ultimately brought with them new structures, new interpretations of their traditional culture. Some of it was welcomed. We see this with music and with dance and with martial arts. But then we also see a great deal of conflict between families that stayed in Japan for 1, 2, 3 or more generations, and those that return, that seem affected by this contact with an outside national culture. Well, as you can imagine, people adapt. Even though there was isolation which occurred for these returning populations when they returned to Japan, there was an active need to express themselves, to remain true to who they have become in a sense. And we see this with many of the annual festivals that populations of one-time Japanese and Brazilian migrants hold in both Japan and today in Brazil as well. The music, the combined languages or the creolized languages, the dance, the art, all of this expresses this unique blending of cultures that really has little to nothing to do with what caused the blending in the first place.